My stepmother spent 10 years calling me a freeloader in my own house. Her face was priceless when she discovered I was the one keeping them afloat. So, my mom died when I was 14, and it was just me and my dad for 3 years. Then Dad met Carol at some work conference when I was 17. She was an office manager at this medical supply company and acted like she ran the whole healthcare industry. Within 6 months, they were married and she moved in. First thing Carol did was lecture me about contributing to the household. She said I was old enough to work and shouldn't expect handouts. I was 17, studying for SATs, and working weekends at a tutoring center. She wanted half my paycheck for groceries, even though Dad had always covered everything fine. She'd stand there every Saturday with her hand out waiting for my cash. If I needed money for school supplies, Carol would make me write a formal request explaining why I couldn't budget better. She'd deny half of them, saying I needed to learn priorities. She actually created a chart showing how much I cost the household monthly in food, electricity, water, even toilet paper. She'd update it weekly and stick it on my door. When I started college, Carol got worse. She said adults don't live off their parents, and since I was 18, I was an adult. She made me get a second job during semester breaks. She'd calculate how many hours I could work between classes and tell me I was lazy if I didn't maximize every minute. She forced me to pay for my own health insurance, even though I could have stayed on Dad's plan. Every family dinner became a lecture about self-sufficiency. She'd tell her sisters how she was teaching me not to be a parasite on society. She actually used that word, parasite. She'd complain that her generation worked through college without help, and mine just expected everything handed to us. She made me pay her back for birthday presents, saying gifts were for children. When I graduated and got an entry-level job at a pharmaceutical company, Carol said I should be paying them rent since I still lived at home. I was 22, making barely enough to cover my student loans. She wanted $800 a month plus utilities. She said if I couldn't afford it, maybe I should have studied something useful instead of chemistry. She'd leave printed articles on my bed about millennials living with parents being the downfall of America. For 5 years, Carol made my life hell. She'd introduce me to people as her unemployed stepchild, even though I worked 50 hours a week. When I got promoted, she said it was probably diversity hiring. When I bought professional clothes, she said I was wasting money trying to look important. She told everyone at Dad's birthday that they were still supporting a grown adult who couldn't make it alone. She'd constantly mention her friends' kids who were doctors and lawyers by my age. She said I'd probably never amount to anything because I lacked drive. She actually brought home job applications for fast food places, saying maybe I'd do better with simpler work. She created a timeline showing where I should be in life versus where I was, with big red marks showing how far behind I was. When I turned 28, Carol announced at Thanksgiving that she decided to stop enabling me. She said after 10 years of freeloading, I needed tough love. She actually evicted me, giving me 30 days to move out. Dad said nothing. She posted on social media about finally putting her foot down with her entitled stepchild. I moved into a small apartment near work. Carol told everyone she'd finally freed herself from supporting a leech. She said maybe now I'd learn to be self-reliant. She threw a party to celebrate getting her house back. 6 months later, Carol's company announced a merger. She was thrilled because she thought she'd get a big promotion. She spent weeks bragging about how her hard work was finally paying off, unlike some people who expected handouts. She bought new clothes for meeting the new executives. She told everyone her career was about to skyrocket. The merger meeting was scheduled for Monday morning. Carol walked in expecting to meet some corporate executives from New York. Instead, she found me. I was the lead on the acquisition team. Turns out, the pharmaceutical company I'd been working for had been quietly buying medical supply companies. The entry-level job Carol mocked had turned into a senior position overseeing acquisitions. I'd specifically pushed for buying her company because I knew their contracts inside out. Carol's face went white when she saw me at the head of the conference table. I kept my face completely blank as Carol stared at me from her seat 3 chairs down. She looked like someone had dumped ice water over her head. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. I clicked to the first slide of my presentation and stood up. The other executives from her company shifted in their seats, probably wondering why their office manager looked ready to pass out. I introduced myself as lead acquisition specialist for the pharmaceutical division and explained that I'd be managing the integration of their medical supply company over the next 4 months. My voice came out steady and professional. Carol's hand gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles went white. I walked through the timeline on the screen, pointing out key dates for personnel reviews and operational assessments. Carol's boss, Damien, took notes on his tablet, while 2 other managers asked questions about reporting structures. Carol just sat there frozen, her face getting paler by the second. Carol finally found her voice about 10 minutes into my presentation. She asked if this was some kind of joke, and her words came out shaky and thin. I looked directly at her for the first time since starting, and kept my expression neutral. I explained calmly that I'd been with the pharmaceutical company for 6 years now. Started as an entry-level analyst right after college, and worked my way up through 3 promotions. Made senior acquisition specialist 2 years ago, and now led a team of 12 people. I mentioned that I'd specifically recommended her company as an acquisition target because I knew their contract structures really well. Had studied them extensively during my research phase. Carol's face somehow got even whiter. She looked down at her folder and I could see her hands trembling. Damien glanced between us with confusion written all over his face but didn't say anything. I transitioned smoothly into the merger overview section, clicking through slides about integration timelines and restructuring plans. The other executives leaned forward to read the details, while Carol sat perfectly still like someone had hit pause on her. I outlined how we'd be evaluating every employee over the next 60 days. Explained that we'd assess each person's value to the merged organization and make decisions about retention or severance after that period. Mentioned that we'd be consolidating departments and eliminating redundant positions to maximize efficiency. Carol's breathing got faster, and I could see her chest rising and falling quickly. I kept talking about operational synergies and cost reduction targets. Listed the departments that would see the biggest changes. Her department was third on that list. One of the other managers asked about severance packages, and I walked through our standard terms. 3 months' pay plus benefits continuation and outplacement services. Carol looked like she might throw up. About 20 minutes into the presentation, I noticed Carol's hand moving under the table. She was trying to be subtle about it, but I could see the glow of her phone screen reflected on her face. Her thumbs moved quickly across the screen, and I knew exactly who she was texting. Dad was probably at his consulting job right now, completely confused about why Carol was sending him panic messages about me being her new boss. I didn't react at all, just continued explaining how we'd assess each employee's contribution to the merged organization. Talked about performance metrics and evaluation criteria. Mentioned that decisions would be based purely on professional factors and documented work history. Carol's phone buzzed quietly, and she glanced down at it. Whatever Dad replied made her face crumple for just a second before she forced it back to neutral. I moved on to the next slide about timeline milestones and implementation phases. I opened the floor for questions after finishing the integration overview. Damien raised his hand first and asked about management structure in the new company. I pulled up the organizational chart and walked through how we'd be flattening the hierarchy. Explained that we were eliminating 3 layers of middle management to create more direct reporting lines. Pointed out that office managers and administrative coordinators would be consolidated into a single operations team. Carol went completely rigid in her seat. Everyone in corporate knew that office manager positions were usually the first to go in mergers because they were considered redundant with existing staff. I kept my tone matter-of-fact as I explained the rationale behind each structural change. Damien nodded along and made more notes. Carol's jaw was clenched, so tight I could see the muscles jumping in her cheek. Another manager asked about the timeline for personnel decisions, and I said we'd have preliminary recommendations by week 8 of the integration process. The meeting broke for lunch at noon, and Carol practically ran out of the conference room. She grabbed her purse and phone and headed straight for the elevators without making eye contact with anyone. I stayed behind to pack up my laptop and presentation materials. Damien walked over and asked if I had a few minutes to chat. We went to the break room and grabbed coffee while the other executives filed out to find food. Damien stirred cream into his cup and mentioned that Carol had been difficult to work with lately. Said she'd been complaining constantly about younger employees and their supposed lack of work ethic. Told me she resisted every procedural change he tried to implement, claiming her way of doing things had worked fine for 20 years. He looked tired just talking about it. Asked if the merger might be a good opportunity to address some of these performance issues that had been building up. I kept my response professional and said we'd be doing thorough evaluations of everyone based on documented metrics and team feedback. My supervisor, Ananya, found me in the break room about 10 minutes later. She pulled me aside near the windows and asked quietly if I was okay. Said she'd noticed some weird tension with Carol during the presentation. I gave her the short version. Told her Carol was my stepmother who'd made my life complete hell for 10 years. Called me a freeloader and a parasite. Charged me rent when I could barely afford student loans. Kicked me out 6 months ago. Ananya's expression shifted from concern to angry in about 2 seconds. Her face got hard, and she said some words about Carol that I won't repeat here. Then she told me she'd watch my back during this whole process. Make sure everything stayed professional and by the book. Said if Carol tried any family drama or attempted to claim bias, Ananya would shut it down immediately with documentation. I thanked her, and we headed back to the conference room as people started returning from lunch. Carol came back right before we reconvened, and she'd clearly been crying. Her eyes were red and puffy, even though she'd tried to cover it with fresh makeup. She'd reapplied her lipstick, but it was slightly smudged at one corner. She sat down in her seat and wouldn't look at anyone. I started the afternoon session on operational integration, pulling up detailed slides about supply chain consolidation and inventory management systems. Kept everything completely professional and technical. Walked through each process change step by step with supporting data and cost analysis. Carol squirmed in her seat the whole time. She kept shifting her weight and crossing and uncrossing her legs. Picked at her cuticles until I saw a spot of blood on her thumb. I talked about standardizing ordering procedures and implementing our existing vendor management software across all locations. Explained how we'd be training everyone on the new systems over a 6-week period. Carol interrupted about 30 minutes into the supply chain section. Her voice came out too loud and a little shrill. She suggested that her department's current processes were already really efficient and didn't need to be changed. Said they'd been doing things the same way for years and it worked perfectly fine. I stopped talking and looked at her calmly, waited a beat before responding. Then I politely but firmly explained that our analysis showed significant cost savings through standardization. Pulled up a slide with actual numbers showing how much money we'd save by consolidating vendors and using our bulk purchasing agreements. Mentioned that personal preferences wouldn't factor into operational decisions because we had to base everything on data and measurable outcomes. Carol's face flushed red and she looked down at the table. Damien cleared his throat awkwardly. I moved on to the next section about inventory tracking systems, and no one else interrupted for the rest of the presentation. The meeting finally ended at 4, and everyone started packing up their things. Carol approached me in the hallway as I was heading back to collect my materials. She tried to catch my eye and said she needed to speak with me privately. Her voice had that desperate edge to it. I stopped walking but kept my expression neutral. Told her that all communication regarding the merger needed to go through official channels. Said I'd be sending out a company email with the proper procedures for questions and concerns. Carol's eyes got shiny like she might start crying again. She started to say something about family and how we needed to talk about this situation. I cut her off before she could finish. Explained that my professional obligations required strict boundaries during acquisition processes. Said it would be inappropriate for me to have private conversations with employees being evaluated. Told her to direct any questions to the HR liaison or the integration team email address. Then I walked past her into the conference room to grab my laptop bag. When I came back out, she was gone. I drove back to my office and spent the rest of the afternoon finishing up the integration timeline documents. Around 6, I packed up my laptop and headed to the parking garage. My phone started buzzing as soon as I got in my car. Dad's name lit up the screen. I let it go to voicemail. He called again immediately. Then again. I pulled out of the parking garage and drove toward my apartment while the phone kept buzzing in the cup holder. By the time I got home, I had 17 missed calls from him. I made dinner, ate it standing at my kitchen counter, and finally called him back around 8. He answered on the first ring and started talking before I could say anything. His voice sounded tight and confused. He said Carol had come home from the merger meeting completely shaken up. She'd been crying for hours. She told him I was somehow her new boss, that I was the one leading the acquisition of her company. He said he didn't understand how this was possible because Carol had always said I was working some basic job at a pharmaceutical company. He kept asking how I'd ended up in charge of buying out her employer. His voice had this desperate quality like he needed me to explain that there'd been some mistake. I let him keep talking until he ran out of steam. Then I told him the truth in the calmest voice I could manage. Carol had never bothered to ask about my actual career because she was too busy calling me a freeloader. I explained that I'd been promoted 4 times in the past 6 years. I led a team of 12 analysts. I made more money than both of them combined. But Carol had been too occupied with her lectures about my failures to notice any of my actual accomplishments. She'd been so convinced I was worthless that she never looked at what I was really doing with my life. Dad went quiet for a long moment. Then he tried to smooth everything over. He said Carol was just surprised by the situation. He suggested we should all have dinner together as a family to talk things through properly. He used that tone he always used when he wanted me to make peace with Carol after she'd been particularly cruel. That careful, pleading voice asking me to be the bigger person. I told him there was nothing to talk through. This was a professional business situation. If Carol couldn't handle being evaluated by someone she'd spent 10 years calling incompetent, that was her problem to solve, not mine. I said I had to go and ended the call before he could argue. The next morning, I got to the office early and started working through emails. Around 9, one from Carol appeared in my inbox. The subject line said, "Private meeting request." She wrote that she wanted to discuss her role in the merged company and thought it would be better if we could talk privately about the situation given our family connection. Her tone tried to sound professional, but I could read the panic underneath. I forwarded the email to Ananya and Cadence in HR, wrote a brief explanation about the family relationship, and asked them to handle all direct communication with Carol going forward. Said I wanted to avoid any appearance of bias or improper conduct during the evaluation process. Ananya responded within 10 minutes saying she'd loop in Cadence and they'd take care of it. Cadence sent Carol a meeting invitation for later that week. I made sure I wasn't included on the invite. When the meeting happened, I stayed in my office working on vendor contract reviews. Cadence stopped by around 4 to give me an update. She said Carol had spent the entire hour trying to fish for information about my involvement in decisions regarding her position. Carol kept circling back to our personal history instead of focusing on her actual job performance. Cadence said it was pretty clear Carol was more worried about our relationship than about demonstrating her professional value to the company. During the first week of integration, I started reviewing personnel files for all the medical supply company employees. Had to assess who brought real value and who was just taking up space. Carol's file was thick with documentation. Multiple complaints from younger employees about her attitude. Comments about her being condescending and resistant to any new procedures or technology updates. One guy named Timothy from her department had submitted a formal complaint 6 months ago. He wrote that Carol frequently made dismissive comments about millennials and their work ethic. Said she created a hostile environment for anyone under 40. I scheduled interviews with everyone in Carol's department to get a clear picture of how things actually functioned. Had Ananya conduct all of them instead of me to keep everything clean and unbiased. She spent 3 days talking to Carol's team members. The feedback came back consistently negative. People described Carol's management style as controlling, said she dismissed any input from her team and refused to consider improvements to their processes. Multiple employees mentioned that she treated suggestions like personal attacks. One woman said Carol had blocked 3 different efficiency proposals over the past year just because they came from younger staff members. My phone rang Thursday evening while I was reviewing Ananya's interview notes. Reese calling to check in. We'd been friends since sophomore year of college. I told him about the whole situation with Carol and the merger. He laughed and said he remembered me showing up at his apartment during semester breaks just to escape her constant criticism. He said those were some of the most stressed out he'd ever seen me. Then he said he was glad I was finally in a position where she couldn't make me feel worthless anymore. Said it was about time Carol faced some consequences for how she'd treated me. Friday afternoon, my assistant buzzed me to say I had a visitor in the lobby. I wasn't expecting anyone. Went down to find Dad standing there looking uncomfortable in khakis and a polo shirt. He said he needed to talk to me about Carol's situation. Started asking me to go easy on her during the evaluation process. Said she was really struggling with the stress and he was worried about her. I told him this was a professional business matter and he needed to leave. He kept pushing, saying I called security and had them escort him out of the building. Sent him an email from my desk explaining that his attempt to interfere with a business process was completely inappropriate and wouldn't be tolerated under any circumstances. Monday morning, another email from Carol appeared. Different tone this time. She apologized for how she'd treated me over the years, said she knew she'd been too hard on me and wanted to know if we could move past it. Asked if we could put family first and work together professionally. The whole thing read like she'd spent the weekend crafting it carefully. I didn't respond to her directly, just forwarded it to Cadence and copied the merger attorney. Added a note documenting her attempt to use our personal relationship to influence her professional evaluation. Let them handle it through proper channels. 3 weeks into the merger process, Damien stopped by my office unannounced. He asked if we could talk privately about Carol's performance history. I closed the door and gestured to the chair across from my desk. He sat down and rubbed his face with both hands. He looked tired, older than his file photo suggested. He told me he'd been wanting to address Carol's issues for years, but couldn't find a way to do it safely. Every time he tried to give her constructive feedback, she'd threaten to file age discrimination complaints with HR. She'd say he was targeting older employees who had institutional knowledge. She'd mention lawyers and hostile work environment claims. He said it was easier to work around her than deal with the potential legal mess. The merger gave him cover to finally be honest about her inadequate performance without worrying about retaliation. He handed me a folder with documentation he'd been keeping privately. Performance reviews where he'd inflated her ratings to avoid confrontation. Emails where she'd refused to implement efficiency improvements. Notes about customer complaints she'd dismissed. He apologized for not handling it sooner and said he hoped this information would help with the evaluation process. Timothy from Carol's department requested a meeting 2 days later. I met him in one of the small conference rooms on the 3rd floor. He looked uncomfortable, kept adjusting his tie and avoiding eye contact. He told me Carol had been talking about me to the team. She was calling me vindictive and power-hungry. She said I was sabotaging her career because of personal family drama. She told people I'd always been jealous of her success, and now I was using my position to destroy her professionally. Timothy said most of the team didn't believe her story. They'd watched me conduct the merger process fairly and professionally. They'd seen me treat everyone with respect during interviews and evaluations. But Carol's constant complaints were creating tension in the office. People felt awkward being around her. Some employees were avoiding her completely because they didn't want to get pulled into whatever conflict she thought was happening. Timothy said he felt obligated to tell me what was going on, even though he knew it might make things worse for Carol. I spent that afternoon documenting everything Timothy told me. I pulled together the timeline of Carol's behavior since the merger announcement. Her attempt to discuss family matters during business hours. Her email trying to leverage our personal relationship for professional advantage. Now spreading rumors about my motives to her coworkers. I compiled witness statements from Timothy and 2 other employees who'd heard Carol's complaints. I scheduled a meeting with Cadence from HR and presented everything in a formal report. Cadence reviewed the documentation carefully, making notes on her tablet. She said this constituted creating a hostile work environment during a transition period. She'd need to bring Carol in for a disciplinary meeting. I told Cadence I wanted to stay completely out of that conversation to avoid any appearance of personal involvement. Cadence agreed and scheduled the meeting for the following Monday. She called Carol in alone, and I stayed in my office working on other acquisition tasks. The meeting lasted over an hour. Cadence told me afterward that Carol tried claiming she was targeted because of her age and her relationship to me. She said the merger process was unfair and biased, but Cadence had statements from multiple witnesses about Carol's unprofessional conduct. The evidence was clear and documented. Cadence issued a formal written warning and told Carol that any further rumors or complaints about bias would result in immediate termination, regardless of the merger outcome. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number that evening. It was my younger cousin Alexis. She said she'd heard about the merger through family gossip and wanted to reach out. We hadn't talked much since I'd moved out of Dad's house. She was 10 years younger than me, still in college. She asked if we could meet for coffee over the weekend. I agreed, and we met at a place near campus on Saturday morning. Alexis looked different from I remembered, more grown up. She ordered some complicated drink with extra shots and sat across from me in the corner booth. She said she always hated how Carol treated me at family gatherings. Carol would make snide comments about my life choices whenever I was around. She'd compare me unfavorably to her friends' kids who had better jobs or bigger houses. She'd mention how I was still renting instead of owning property. She'd talk about how some people never learned to be financially responsible. Alexis said everyone else would just sit there quietly and let it happen. Nobody ever told Carol to stop or defended me. People would change the subject or pretend they didn't hear. Alexis said she was too young to speak up back then, but it always bothered her. She wanted me to know that at least one person in the family saw what was really happening. The financial audit results came back the following week. I sat in my office reading through the report with growing interest. Carol's department had been significantly over budget for 3 consecutive years. The auditor found inefficient processes that wasted time and money. Multiple proposals for cost-saving technology upgrades had been rejected. The auditor noted specifically that Carol had blocked automation systems that would have saved the company over $200,000 annually. She'd written in email responses that the current manual systems worked fine and didn't need changing. She'd claimed the technology was unnecessary and too complicated for her team to learn. The auditor documented at least 5 separate occasions where Carol's resistance to modernization had directly cost the company money. The report recommended immediate implementation of the previously rejected upgrades and suggested that management resistance to efficiency improvements indicated deeper performance problems. I reviewed the audit results with Ananya in her office that afternoon. She read through the report while I sat across from her desk. When she finished, she looked up at me and asked directly what I wanted to happen with Carol. The question caught me off guard. I sat there for a minute trying to figure out how to answer honestly. Part of me wanted to see Carol face real consequences for how she treated me. I wanted her to understand what it felt like to have someone in power dismiss your worth and mock your efforts. But another part of me knew that using my professional position for personal revenge would make me just as bad as she'd been. I told Ananya I didn't know what the right answer was. I felt stuck between justified anger and trying to be a decent person. Ananya nodded like she understood the conflict. She told me about her own experience with an abusive family member. Her uncle had controlled and manipulated her family for years. She'd spent a long time wanting revenge, imagining scenarios where he'd finally face consequences. But eventually she learned that real power wasn't about getting revenge. It was about not letting their toxicity define your choices. She said whatever decision I made about Carol needed to be based on legitimate business reasons, not personal satisfaction. If Carol's performance justified termination, then that was a business decision. If I kept her employed just to prove I wasn't vindictive, that would be letting our history control me just as much as firing her out of spite. The key was making a choice I could justify professionally regardless of our personal relationship. That weekend there was a family gathering at my aunt's house. I didn't go. I hadn't been to family events since moving out of Dad's house. Alexis texted me updates throughout the afternoon. Carol was apparently telling everyone that I was abusing my position to punish her for being a strict stepmother. She said she'd only tried to teach me responsibility and independence. Now I was using corporate power to destroy her career out of petty revenge. Dad backed up her version of events. He told relatives that Carol had been tough on me because she cared about my future. He said I was holding a grudge over normal parenting decisions. Alexis said other relatives looked uncomfortable, but nobody spoke up to challenge the story. People nodded politely and changed the subject. A few family members made sympathetic noises about how hard mergers must be. Nobody asked about my side or questioned Carol's victim narrative. I spent Sunday evening writing a detailed email to several family members I trusted. My aunt, who'd always been kind to me. 2 older cousins who'd known me before Carol came into the picture. Alexis. I laid out the full history of Carol's financial and emotional abuse over 10 years. I included specific examples with dates and dollar amounts. The chart she'd made showing how much I cost them in toilet paper. The $800 monthly rent she'd charged when I was 22 and barely surviving. The $30,000 total she'd taken from me over the years. The eviction notice she'd served at Thanksgiving. The party she'd thrown to celebrate getting rid of me. I made it clear this wasn't strict parenting or tough love. It was systematic cruelty designed to make me feel worthless and dependent. I explained that my professional evaluation of her company had nothing to do with our history. The performance problems were documented by her own boss in a financial audit. I wasn't punishing her for being a stepmother. I was doing my job evaluating an acquisition target. The responses started coming in Monday morning. My aunt wrote back immediately saying she always thought Carol was too hard on me, but didn't feel it was her place to interfere in how Dad ran his household. She apologized for not speaking up when she witnessed some of the treatment. One cousin said he'd noticed Carol's comments at family events, but assumed I could handle it since I was an adult. He felt bad now, realizing how much worse it was in private. Another cousin defended Carol, saying she was just trying to teach me responsibility in a world that coddles young people too much. He said maybe I was being oversensitive about normal expectations for contributing to a household. Alexis responded saying she was glad I'd finally told people the truth because Carol's victim act at the gathering had made her sick. She said she'd tried to say something, but Dad had shut her down. The mixed responses were exactly what I'd expected. Some people got it. Others would always find ways to excuse Carol's behavior or minimize what had happened. At least now the truth was documented somewhere besides my own memory. Monday morning, I walked into the office and found Cadence waiting outside my door with a thick folder under her arm. She asked if I had time to review Carol's evaluation results. I nodded and let her into my office. She spread the documents across my desk while I grabbed coffee. The numbers were clear. Carol's department had the highest overhead costs in the entire company relative to output. Her team's productivity metrics ranked in the bottom 15% compared to similar divisions at other medical supply companies. The financial audit showed she'd rejected 3 separate proposals for automation upgrades that would have saved the company over $200,000 annually. Her performance reviews from Damien were mediocre at best, with multiple notes about resistance to change and difficulty accepting feedback. Then there were the complaints. 6 different employees had filed informal grievances about Carol's management style over the past 2 years. The HR notes described her as condescending, dismissive of younger workers, and prone to making comments about millennials lacking work ethic. Timothy's statement was particularly detailed, documenting instances where Carol had publicly criticized team members for suggesting process improvements. Cadence pointed to a section highlighting Carol's behavior during the merger transition. She'd been caught spreading rumors about me to her team, claiming I was sabotaging her position out of personal vendetta. 3 separate witnesses had reported her making unprofessional comments about the acquisition process. The documented pattern showed someone who couldn't adapt to change and actively undermined organizational goals when she disagreed with them. Cadence looked at me across the desk and said the data made a strong case for eliminating Carol's position entirely. Her role overlapped significantly with existing pharmaceutical company management structures. Her performance history showed consistent resistance to the kind of operational improvements the merger was designed to implement. Her recent conduct during the transition had created team morale issues that would only get worse if she remained in a management role. I stared at the papers spread across my desk. This was it. The business case was solid. Carol's position was redundant. Her performance was subpar. Her behavior was unprofessional. Any reasonable executive would recommend her for severance, but I knew what people would say. They'd say I used my corporate power to destroy my stepmother's career because she was tough on me growing up. They'd say this was revenge dressed up in business language. They'd say I couldn't separate personal feelings from professional judgment. I asked Cadence for a few days to review everything thoroughly. She agreed and gathered up the documents, leaving copies for me to study. After she left, I sat there looking at the folder. Part of me felt vindicated seeing Carol's failures documented in black and white. All those years she'd called me incompetent and lazy, she'd been the one underperforming. All those lectures about my lack of drive, while she was actively blocking improvements that could have helped her company. But another part of me felt sick. I had the power to end Carol's career. One recommendation from me and she'd be out. Was I really going to do this? Could I live with myself if I did? Would I be any better than her if I used my position to hurt her the way she'd hurt me? I spent the next 2 days barely sleeping. I kept opening Carol's personnel file and trying to read it objectively. If this was anyone else, what would I recommend? If I didn't know Carol, didn't have 10 years of history with her, what would the right business decision be? The answer was obvious. Her position was redundant with existing management. Her performance was consistently below average. Her resistance to change directly contradicted the merger's core objectives. Her recent unprofessional behavior had damaged team morale. Any other employee with this record would be recommended for severance without hesitation. But this wasn't any other employee. This was Carol. The woman who'd made my life hell for a decade. The woman who'd called me a parasite and a freeloader. The woman who'd charged me for birthday presents and evicted me from my own home. If I recommended her termination, was I being objective or vindictive? Thursday afternoon, my phone rang. Dad's name appeared on the screen. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. He started yelling before I could say hello. He said I was deliberately destroying Carol's career out of spite. He said I was using my corporate position to punish her for being a strict stepmother. He said this was cruel and vindictive and he'd raised me better than this. I let him finish his rant before I spoke. I asked him where this protective energy had been during the 10 years Carol was destroying my self-worth. I asked him why Carol's feelings mattered more than the decade of damage she'd done to me. I asked him if he remembered standing silent while she called me a parasite at family dinners. Dad tried to interrupt, but I kept talking. I said Carol hadn't been a strict stepmother. She'd been abusive. She'd systematically torn me down to make herself feel important. She'd taken over $30,000 from me when I was barely surviving. She'd made charts showing how much I cost them in toilet paper. She'd evicted me and thrown a party to celebrate getting rid of me. Where was his anger then? Why hadn't he protected his own child from her cruelty? Dad's voice changed. He said I was exaggerating. Carol had just been trying to teach me responsibility. She'd wanted me to be independent and self-sufficient. Her methods might have been harsh, but her intentions were good. She'd been preparing me for the real world. I felt something crack inside me. I told Dad we needed to have a real conversation about his enabling behavior. Every time he'd stood silent while Carol called me a parasite, he'd chosen her cruelty over his own child. Every time he'd let her charge me for birthday presents, he'd endorsed her abuse. Every time he'd watched her humiliate me at family dinners without saying a word, he'd been just as responsible for the damage as she was. His silence hadn't been neutral. It had been a choice. He'd chosen Carol's comfort over my well-being for 10 solid years. Dad tried to defend himself. He said he'd thought Carol's tough love would motivate me to be independent. He said he hadn't realized how much it was hurting me. He said if he'd known it was that bad, he would have said something. I laughed. It wasn't a nice laugh. I told him that was a convenient excuse for a decade of cowardice. He'd seen exactly what Carol was doing. He'd been there when she made me write formal requests for school supplies. He'd watched her create charts showing how much I cost them. He'd heard her call me a parasite at family gatherings. He hadn't been blind. He'd been complicit. His passive enabling had been just as damaging as Carol's active abuse because it had taught me that nobody would stand up for me, not even my own father. The conversation ended with Dad hanging up on me. I sat there holding my phone, shaking. That night I couldn't focus on anything. I kept replaying the conversation with Dad, kept seeing Carol's personnel file spread across my desk, kept thinking about what kind of person I wanted to be. Friday morning I called in sick and spent the day at home. I made coffee and sat on my couch with Carol's file. I forced myself to read every page without thinking about our history. Just the facts, just the performance data, just the business case. The evidence was overwhelming. Carol's position was genuinely redundant. Her performance was legitimately subpar. Her resistance to change was documentably harmful to company objectives. Her recent behavior was professionally unacceptable, regardless of personal relationships. If she were anyone else, the recommendation would be obvious. But she wasn't anyone else. She was Carol. And I had to decide what kind of person I was going to be in this situation. Was I going to let her keep a job she was bad at just to prove I wasn't vindictive? Or was I going to make the right business decision, even though it would look like revenge? Saturday afternoon, Reese showed up at my apartment with takeout. He said I'd sounded weird on the phone and he wanted to check on me. We ate Chinese food on my couch while I told him everything about Carol's evaluation and my conversation with Dad. Reese listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a minute. Then he said something that stuck with me. He said letting Carol keep a job she was bad at just to prove I wasn't vindictive would be its own form of dysfunction. He said holding her accountable for legitimate professional failures wasn't the same as revenge. He reminded me that I used to come to his apartment during college breaks just to escape Carol's constant criticism. He'd watched me struggle under her abuse for years. Now I had documentation showing she'd been just as bad at her job as she'd been at being a stepmother. Making the right business decision based on solid evidence wasn't revenge. It was accountability. Carol had spent 10 years avoiding accountability for her behavior. Maybe it was time she faced some consequences. Monday morning, I scheduled a meeting with Ananya and Cadence. I brought Carol's complete personnel file plus my own documentation, showing how I'd separated personal history from professional evaluation. I started the meeting by acknowledging up front that Carol was my stepmother, and we had a difficult history. I explained that I'd spent days reviewing her file objectively, trying to make a decision I could live with regardless of our relationship. Then I presented the business case. Carol's position was redundant with existing pharmaceutical management structures. Her performance metrics were consistently below average. Her resistance to operational improvements directly contradicted merger objectives. Her recent unprofessional conduct had created team morale problems. I recommended eliminating her position and offering a standard severance package. Cadence reviewed my documentation carefully. She asked several questions about specific performance issues and the redundancy analysis. She examined the complaints from Carol's team members and the notes about her behavior during the transition. After 20 minutes, she looked up and said the case for eliminating Carol's position was solid. The evidence was clear. The business justification was sound. My documentation showed I'd made every effort to evaluate her objectively, despite our personal relationship. Cadence said she'd handle the termination conversation herself to avoid any appearance that I was personally involved in the decision. The meeting would happen Wednesday morning. Carol would receive 3 months severance plus outplacement services to help her find a new position. I walked out of that meeting feeling empty. I'd made the decision. Carol was done. Wednesday morning, I got to work early and tried to focus on other projects. I knew Cadence was meeting with Carol at 10. I kept checking my phone even though I knew nobody would update me during the meeting. Around 11, my email dinged. New message from Carol. My stomach dropped. I almost deleted it without reading, but something made me open it. The email was different from her previous attempts at manipulation. No demands, no victim narrative, no threats about family consequences, just honesty. Carol wrote that she'd treated me terribly because she'd felt threatened by my education and potential. She'd been an office manager with a high school diploma watching me go to college and build a real career. She'd felt small and worthless next to my possibilities, so she'd tried to cut me down to make herself feel more important. She'd called me a freeloader because she was terrified of being seen as worthless herself. She'd charged me money and created charts and lectured me about self-sufficiency because it gave her a sense of power she didn't have anywhere else in her life. She'd spent 10 years projecting her own insecurities onto me, making me carry the weight of her fears about her own inadequacy. Carol wrote that watching me succeed despite her attempts to undermine me had forced her to confront how cruel she'd been. She said she knew this email wouldn't change anything about her job situation. She understood the business case for eliminating her position was legitimate, but she wanted me to know that she finally understood what she'd done to me and how much damage she'd caused. She said she was sorry. I read the email 3 times. Part of me felt vindicated. Carol finally admitting she'd been wrong, acknowledging the abuse, taking responsibility for the damage. But another part of me just felt sad. Understanding why someone abused you doesn't erase what they did. Knowing Carol had been driven by insecurity didn't give me back the 10 years she'd stolen. Her apology didn't undo the $30,000 she'd taken, or the constant humiliation, or the charts on my door showing how much I cost them in toilet paper. I sat there staring at my computer screen trying to figure out what to feel. Carol had finally given me the acknowledgement I'd wanted for years. But it came too late, after I'd already made the decision that would end her career. Was this genuine self-awareness, or just a last desperate attempt to save her job? Did it even matter? I closed the email and sat staring at the screen for a long time. The words kept running through my head. Carol finally admitting she'd felt small and worthless next to my education. That she'd tried to cut me down because watching me go to college made her feel inadequate. That calling me a freeloader was really about her own fears of being worthless. Part of me felt good about it. This was the acknowledgement I'd wanted for 10 years. Carol finally saying she was wrong, that she'd been cruel, that she'd damaged me on purpose. But another part of me just felt empty. Understanding why someone hurt you doesn't undo what they did. Knowing Carol had been driven by her own problems didn't give me back the decade she'd stolen. Her apology didn't erase the $30,000 she'd taken from me, or the constant put-downs, or the charts she'd stick on my door showing how much I cost them. I kept reading the email over and over, trying to figure out what I was supposed to feel. Was this real self-awareness, or just one last try at saving her job? Did she actually understand what she'd done to me, or was this another manipulation? I thought about all the times she'd made me feel worthless, the way she'd stand there every Saturday waiting for my paycheck, the birthday presents she'd made me pay back, the job applications for fast food places she'd brought home, the party she threw when I finally moved out. Every single moment of those 10 years played through my head while I sat there looking at her words on the screen. The email said she knew it wouldn't change anything about her job situation, that she understood the business case for getting rid of her position was real, but she wanted me to know she finally got what she'd done. I closed my laptop and walked to the window. The city stretched out below my office, all those buildings full of people living their own complicated lives. Carol's honesty felt important somehow, but also too late. Way too late. She'd spent a decade trying to destroy my confidence, and now that I had the power to affect her career, suddenly she understood how wrong she'd been. The timing felt suspicious even if the words sounded real. I typed out a response to Carol's email, kept it short and professional. I told her I appreciated her being honest about what had driven her behavior over the years. That understanding her reasons helped explain things, but didn't erase the damage. I wrote that professional decisions about the merger had to be based on business needs, not personal relationships. That I hoped she'd find a position that was a better fit for her skills, but this company wasn't the right place for her anymore. I read it 3 times before sending it. Made sure there was nothing angry or mean in the words, just clear and direct. This was a business decision based on real problems with her performance. Our personal history wasn't driving it, even though I couldn't pretend that history didn't exist. I hit send and closed my email. Whatever happened next was out of my hands now. Wednesday morning arrived cold and gray. I got to the office early and tried to focus on other projects. Spreadsheets that needed reviewing, emails that needed responses, anything to keep my mind busy. I knew Cadence was meeting with Carol at 10 to deliver the severance package. 3 months of pay plus help finding a new job. More than a lot of companies would offer. I kept checking my phone even though nobody was going to update me during the meeting. Around 11, my email dinged. Message from Cadence with the subject line, Carol meeting complete. I opened it. Cadence wrote that Carol had taken the news quietly. No drama, no victim story, no threats about going to family or making trouble. She'd asked a few questions about the severance terms and the outplacement services. Signed the paperwork. Packed up her desk. Left the building without causing a scene. Cadence said she'd seemed sad, but also maybe a little relieved. Like some part of her had known this was coming and had made peace with it. I read the message twice. This wasn't how I'd expected it to go. I'd thought Carol would make a big production out of it. Play the victim. Try to get people on her side. But apparently she'd just accepted it and moved on. I didn't know what to do with that. My phone rang 2 hours later. Dad's name on the screen. I almost didn't answer but knew that would just make things worse. I picked up. Dad started yelling before I could even say hello. Accusing me of ruining Carol's career. Saying I'd destroyed their financial stability. That I'd used my position to get revenge for personal reasons. His voice was shaking with anger. I let him talk himself out before responding. Told him calmly that Carol's position had been cut due to being extra and performance problems that existed long before I was involved. That the severance package she got was actually better than what most companies offer. That this was a legitimate business decision based on real issues with her work. Dad said that was garbage. That I'd clearly targeted her because of our history. That I was being cruel and taking advantage of my power. I asked him if he'd ever looked at Carol's performance reviews, if he knew about the complaints from her team, if he understood that her department had been over budget for 3 years because she refused to update their systems. He went quiet for a second, then said that didn't matter because I should have found a way to keep her on. That family was supposed to protect each other. I felt something snap inside me. Told Dad that if he was worried about their finances, maybe he should know that Carol spent 10 years taking money from me. That I'd calculated she took over $30,000 from me during those years when I was barely surviving on entry-level pay. Money I could have used to pay off student loans or save for my future. Money she demanded while calling me a freeloader and a parasite. Dad tried to interrupt, but I kept talking. Told him about the $800 a month in rent she charged me when I was 22. The charts she'd make showing how much I cost them in toilet paper. The way she'd make me write formal requests for school supplies. Every birthday present I had to pay back. Every lecture about being worthless. Every time she told people I was unemployed when I was working 50 hours a week. I laid it all out while Dad sat silent on the other end of the phone. Asked him where all that money went since it clearly wasn't needed for household expenses. Told him Carol had been stealing from me for a decade while making me feel like garbage for existing. Dad's voice came back quiet and defensive. Said he didn't know Carol had taken that much money. That he'd thought she was just teaching me responsibility. I laughed at that. Asked him how charging your stepson for birthday presents teaches responsibility. How humiliating someone at family dinners teaches anything except cruelty. Told him I was done protecting his feelings about Carol's problems when he never protected me from her abuse. That if he wanted any relationship with me going forward, he needed to stop making excuses for what she'd done. That he needed to acknowledge he'd stood by and watched her treat me like trash for 10 years and never said a word. That his silence had been its own choice and it had damaged our relationship maybe beyond repair. I told him I didn't want to hear about Carol's feelings or their financial stress or how hard this was for them. That they'd made my life hard for a decade, and now they could figure out how to deal with the results of their choices. The line went quiet for a long time. Then Dad said he needed to think about things and hung up. I sat there holding my phone, feeling shaky and angry and sad all at the same time. 2 weeks passed. Work kept me busy with other projects. The merger wrapped up smoothly. I barely thought about Carol or Dad except late at night when I couldn't sleep. Then my email dinged with a new message from Dad. Long subject line that said I need to say some things. I almost deleted it without reading, but something made me open it. Dad's email was different from anything he'd ever written me before. He said he'd been thinking about our phone call every day since it happened. That he'd realized some hard truths about himself and his choices. He wrote that he'd seen Carol's treatment of me was wrong, but convinced himself it wasn't his place to step in because she was my stepmother and he didn't want to undermine her authority. That he'd told himself she was just being strict when really he knew she was being cruel. That he'd prioritized keeping his marriage comfortable over protecting his own kid. He admitted he'd let Carol take money from me that we didn't need because it was easier than confronting her. That he'd stood quiet at family dinners while she humiliated me because speaking up would have caused conflict he didn't want to deal with. That every time he'd stayed silent, he'd been making a choice that damaged our relationship. Dad wrote that he understood if I couldn't forgive him. That he'd started going to therapy to work through why he'd found it easier to stay quiet than to confront Carol's behavior. That he was trying to understand his own patterns of avoiding conflict even when people he loved were getting hurt. He said he didn't expect me to want a relationship with him right now. That he knew trust took time to rebuild and required consistent changed behavior, not just words. But he wanted me to know he finally saw what he'd done and how much damage his silence had caused. I read Dad's email 3 times. This was the closest he'd ever come to real accountability. Actually naming his choices instead of making excuses. Acknowledging he'd put his marriage ahead of his relationship with me. Admitting his silence had been active harm, not just passive failure. I sat with it for a while. Part of me wanted to believe this was real growth. That Dad was actually working on himself and understanding his role in what happened. But another part of me remembered 10 years of him standing by while Carol tore me down. 10 years of him choosing comfort over protecting me. Words in an email were a start, but they didn't undo a decade of damage. I opened a reply and started typing. Told Dad I appreciated his honesty and was glad he was getting help. That I recognized how hard it probably was to look at his own behavior and take responsibility for it. But I also told him that rebuilding trust would take time and consistent changed behavior, not just an apology email. That I needed space to process everything before I could think about what kind of relationship we might have going forward. That I couldn't just forget 10 years because he'd had one moment of clarity. I wrote that if he was serious about changing, he needed to keep doing the work whether or not I was ready to let him back into my life. That this had to be about him becoming a better person, not about earning his way back to a relationship with me. I hit send and closed my laptop. Whatever happened next was up to him. 3 weeks later, the merger officially closed. The integration team got an email from the CEO praising our work on the smoothest acquisition the company had completed in 5 years. The cost savings exceeded projections by 18%, and employee retention from the acquired company was higher than any previous merger. Ananya forwarded me the email with a note saying she wanted to talk. I found her in her office that afternoon, and she gestured for me to close the door. She told me she'd been watching how I handled the Carol situation from start to finish. That she'd seen me maintain professional standards even when I could have made Carol's life hell. That I'd documented everything, followed proper procedures, and made decisions based on business needs rather than personal revenge. She said she was proud of how I'd navigated an impossible situation without compromising my integrity or the company's interests. I thanked her and admitted there were moments I'd been tempted to abuse my position. She nodded and said the fact that I'd resisted that temptation showed more character than most people had. That the easy path would have been using my power to punish Carol, but I'd chosen the harder road of staying ethical, even when it would have felt good to be cruel. 2 days after the merger closed, I got an email from Timothy. He'd been quiet during the whole process, just doing his job and staying out of the drama. His email thanked me for the changes we'd implemented in his department. He said the team morale had improved so much in just the few weeks since Carol left. That people were actually excited to come to work now, instead of dreading another day of her constant negativity. He wrote that Carol had spent years shooting down every new idea, criticizing younger employees, and creating an atmosphere where people were afraid to suggest improvements. 3 people had been planning to quit before the merger, but now they'd all decided to stay because the work environment felt healthy again. Timothy said he'd watched Carol treat me like garbage at company events over the years, back when she'd drag my dad to the office parties and spend the whole time complaining about her freeloader stepkid. He'd never said anything because it wasn't his place, but he'd always thought she was cruel. He was glad to see me succeed despite her attempts to tear me down. The following Saturday, my cousin Alexis invited me to dinner at her place. She said it was just family who actually cared about me, not the ones who'd stood by while Carol spent a decade making me feel worthless. I showed up to find Alexis, her wife, my Aunt Rachel, and my Uncle Mark. They'd set up a nice meal and opened wine, and Alexis raised her glass to toast my success. We ate and talked, and eventually the conversation turned to Carol. Aunt Rachel admitted she'd seen how Carol treated me at family gatherings for years. The constant comments about my lack of ambition, the snide remarks about me living at home, the way she'd introduced me as her unemployed stepchild even when I was working full-time. Rachel said she'd wanted to say something but didn't know how to intervene without causing family drama. Uncle Mark said the same thing, that he'd watched Carol humiliate me at holiday dinners and felt sick about it, but convinced himself it wasn't his business. Alexis said she'd been younger and didn't have the standing to call out Carol's behavior, but she'd hated every family event where Carol got to perform her narrative about the lazy stepkid she was forced to support. We talked about how family dysfunction thrives on everyone staying silent, how people don't want to make waves or cause conflict, so they let abuse happen right in front of them, how the abuser counts on that silence to maintain their power. Aunt Rachel said she was sorry for not speaking up, and I told her I understood, that confronting Carol would have meant risking her relationship with my dad and causing family conflict nobody wanted to deal with. The next weekend, Reese helped me move into a bigger apartment. I could finally afford a decent place now that I wasn't sending $800 a month to Carol anymore. The new apartment had actual space, a real kitchen and windows that let in natural light. Reese brought beer, and we spent the day unpacking boxes and arranging furniture. He looked around the living room and said, "This was what my place could have looked like years ago if Carol hadn't been bleeding me dry." We laughed about how much had changed in just 6 months. How I'd gone from living in a tiny apartment and sending money to Carol while she called me a parasite, to having a nice place and watching her face consequences for her behavior. Reese reminded me of the times I'd crashed at his place during college breaks because I couldn't stand being around Carol. How I'd work double shifts to avoid going home, then show up at his apartment exhausted because at least there I didn't have to listen to lectures about being a freeloader. He said he was glad I'd finally escaped her control and built a life where I didn't have to justify my existence to someone who got satisfaction from making me feel small. 3 months after the merger closed, Ananya called me into her office. She said the executive team had been reviewing my performance across multiple acquisitions. The medical supply merger had been my highest profile deal, but I'd also led integration on 2 smaller acquisitions simultaneously. All 3 had come in under budget and ahead of schedule. The board had approved a promotion to Director of Acquisitions, which came with a significant raise and my own team of analysts. I'd be overseeing all future acquisition activity for the pharmaceutical division. Ananya said I'd earned it through consistent, excellent work, and the Carol situation had actually demonstrated my ability to handle complex ethical challenges without compromising professional standards. The promotion represented everything Carol had said I'd never achieve. She'd spent 10 years telling me I lacked drive, that I'd never amount to anything, that I should accept simpler work because I wasn't cut out for real success. Now I was a director at 29, managing major corporate acquisitions and leading my own team. A few weeks later, Alexis texted me some family gossip. Carol had found a new job at a smaller medical supply company. The position had less responsibility than her old role and paid about $20,000 less per year. Apparently, the job market for office managers with her experience wasn't great, especially after she'd been let go during a merger. Dad had picked up extra consulting work to make up for Carol's reduced income. They'd had to cut back on expenses and were talking about downsizing their house. Alexis said Carol was still playing the victim to anyone who would listen, claiming I'd abused my position to destroy her career out of spite. But most people weren't buying it anymore because the details didn't support her narrative. I felt a small sense of justice knowing they were experiencing financial stress. Not because I wanted them to suffer, but because it was a tiny dose of what they'd put me through for years. Every month I'd struggled to pay rent while sending Carol money I couldn't afford. Every time I'd had to choose between groceries and student loan payments because Carol demanded her cut. Every moment of stress about making ends meet while Carol threw parties to celebrate getting her house back from the freeloader. Over the next few months, Ananya became more than just my supervisor. She started mentoring me on navigating corporate politics and senior leadership dynamics. We'd have coffee once a week, and she'd share insights about managing teams, handling difficult executives, and building influence across the organization. She encouraged me to pursue an MBA, saying it would position me for VP-level roles within 5 years. One afternoon, she told me about her own family background, how she'd grown up with an abusive stepfather who constantly told her she was stupid and would never succeed. How she'd used that pain as fuel to build her career, proving to herself that his cruelty didn't define her worth or potential. She said success really was the best response to people who tried to make you feel worthless. That living well and achieving your goals was more satisfying than any revenge could be. That Carol would have to live with knowing she'd spent 10 years tearing down someone who succeeded, despite her best efforts to break them. 6 months after the merger, Dad sent me a text asking if we could meet for coffee. I agreed cautiously, curious about what he wanted to say after months of minimal contact. We met at a cafe near my office, and Dad showed up looking older than I remembered. He ordered coffee and then pulled out an envelope. Inside was a check for $30,000. He said he'd calculated how much Carol had taken from me over the years in rent, expense contributions, and various fees she'd invented. He wanted to pay it back even though he knew money couldn't fix the emotional damage. I stared at the check, not sure how to respond. Dad said he'd been doing a lot of thinking since our last conversation, that he'd realized how much financial stress Carol had put me under during years when I was barely surviving, that watching her take money we didn't need while I struggled with student loans and entry-level pay had been wrong, and his silence had made him complicit in that theft. I picked up the check and told Dad I appreciated the gesture, but I also said that real amends meant acknowledging the full scope of what happened. Not minimizing Carol's behavior as tough love or strict parenting, not making excuses about her generation's values or her insecurities, actually seeing the abuse for what it was and taking responsibility for enabling it. Dad nodded and said he understood, that he'd been reading books about enabling behavior and family dysfunction, that he was trying to understand his role in what I'd experienced and why he'd found it easier to stay silent than to confront Carol's cruelty. He admitted that he'd prioritized keeping his marriage comfortable over protecting his own kid, that every time he'd stood quiet while Carol humiliated me, he'd been making an active choice that damaged our relationship. He said he couldn't undo 10 years of harm, but he wanted me to know he finally saw what he'd done. Dad and I talked for over an hour about what a relationship between us might look like going forward. I told him I needed a clear boundary where Carol wasn't part of it, that I had no interest in reconciling with her or pretending the abuse didn't happen for the sake of family harmony. Dad agreed without trying to defend her or push for some future reunion. He said he respected that I needed to protect myself from someone who'd spent a decade trying to destroy my sense of worth. That he wouldn't ask me to have contact with Carol or attend family events where she'd be present. That if he wanted any relationship with me, it would have to be separate from his marriage. I told him I'd think about what that might look like, but I needed him to understand this wasn't something that would heal quickly. That trust took time to rebuild and required consistent changed behavior, not just one conversation and a check. I started seeing Jordan about 8 months after Dad and I started rebuilding our relationship. We met at a pharmaceutical industry mixer where Jordan was representing a biotech startup working on drug delivery systems. We got to talking at the bar and ended up spending 3 hours comparing notes about difficult family situations. Jordan's parents had spent years telling them they'd never succeed without following the family business plan, then acted shocked when Jordan actually made it in a completely different field. We bonded over knowing what it felt like to prove wrong the people who were supposed to believe in you from the start. Our first few dates felt different from any relationship I'd had before because we both understood what it meant to build yourself up after someone spent years trying to tear you down. Jordan didn't need me to explain why I kept my professional achievements quiet around certain people, or why I had trouble accepting help even when I needed it. We'd both learned to be hyper-independent because depending on family had meant opening yourself up to criticism and control. Jordan got why I still felt uncomfortable spending money on anything Carol would have called frivolous, even though I could afford it now. We'd go to dinner and Jordan would gently call me out when I started justifying my order, like I was still writing expense reports for Carol's approval. It felt healthy in a way my previous relationships never did, because we were both working on unlearning the same toxic patterns, instead of one person trying to fix the other. A year after the merger, I got invited to speak on a panel about successful acquisitions at an industry conference in Chicago. The organizers wanted me to discuss the medical supply company integration because it had come in under budget and ahead of schedule. I spent weeks preparing my presentation, focusing on objective evaluation processes and how we'd managed to retain 80% of the workforce despite significant restructuring. During the actual panel, I talked about the importance of not letting personal relationships cloud professional judgment and how easy it would have been to let revenge drive decisions instead of legitimate business needs. I mentioned that one of the biggest challenges in any acquisition is separating emotional reactions from factual assessment, especially when you have history with the people involved. The moderator asked if I'd ever faced a situation where personal feelings threatened to compromise professional objectivity, and I carefully explained that maintaining ethical standards means making decisions you can defend with data, regardless of how you feel about the people affected. After the panel, several attendees approached me with their own stories about navigating professional situations involving difficult personal relationships, and I realized how common this struggle actually was. Alexis called me a few weeks after the conference to catch up, and she mentioned that Carol was still complaining to anyone who would listen about how I'd ruined her life. Apparently, Carol had told multiple family members that I'd sabotaged her career out of spite, conveniently leaving out the decade of abuse or her own performance issues that predated my involvement. Alexis said Carol was playing the victim at every family gathering, acting like she'd been this wonderful stepmother who got betrayed by an ungrateful stepchild. She refused to acknowledge any role in what happened, still insisting she'd just been teaching me responsibility, and I'd taken it personally because my generation couldn't handle tough love. Alexis said it was frustrating to watch because Carol genuinely seemed to believe her own version of events, like she'd rewritten history in her head to avoid confronting what she'd actually done. I realized that some people never develop the self-awareness to take real accountability, and I'd made peace with the fact that Carol would probably never genuinely understand the damage she caused. She'd spend the rest of her life telling herself she was the victim in this story, and there was nothing I could do to change that, because you can't force someone to see what they're determined to ignore. I'm genuinely happy now with my career, my relationship with Jordan, and the life I've built despite Carol's decade-long campaign to make me feel worthless. My team just closed another major acquisition, and I'm being considered for Vice President of Corporate Development. Jordan and I moved in together last month, and we're talking about getting engaged next year. Dad and I have coffee every few weeks, and he's actually making an effort to understand his role in what happened instead of just making excuses. The best revenge turned out to be not revenge at all, but simply succeeding on my own terms and refusing to let Carol's toxicity define my worth or my choices. I don't spend energy thinking about what Carol's doing or whether she'll ever apologize because that's not where my focus needs to be. I built a good life by working hard and refusing to believe the things Carol said about me, and that's enough.